Nia lived in a quiet village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. The people of her village believed in spirits, ancestors, and unseen forces that lurked beyond the safety of their homes. Though she had heard countless tales from the elders about wandering spirits and cursed lands, she never paid much heed to them. But on this particular night, something felt different. The air was unnaturally still. The usual sounds of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls were missing. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land. Nia sat outside her small hut, enjoying the cool night breeze, when she heard it, the faint cry of a baby. At first she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, drifting through the night air like a whisper carried by the wind. Her body stiffened. The sound was coming from the jungle. No one would leave a baby out there, not in the dead of night. Her mind raced with questions. Could it be a lost child? A mother in distress? A shiver ran down her spine as she remembered the stories told by the elders. They often spoke of spirits that imitated human voices, luring people into the wilderness, never to return. The jungle was not a place to be entered after dark. Yet, despite the warnings that had been ingrained in her since childhood, a sense of unease and curiosity took hold of her. She stood up, straining her ears. The crying was distant but clear, a soft, pitiful wail that tugged at her heart. She glanced toward the village, where the warm glow of lanterns flickered in a few huts. Everyone was inside, safe. She should wake someone, tell them what she had heard. But something inside her urged her forward. Grabbing a small lantern, she took hesitant steps toward the jungle's edge. Her heart pounded as she stepped past the last hut, leaving the safety of the village behind. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky. The crying continued, now slightly louder, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Nia hesitated at the tree line, her grip tightening on the lantern handle. She could still turn back. The thought lingered in her mind, but the cries grew more urgent. Someone, or something, was out there. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the jungle, unaware that she was walking straight into a nightmare. As Nia moved deeper into the jungle, a whisper of doubt crept into her mind. The elders had always warned against venturing out at night, especially near the forest. They spoke of spirits that roamed in the darkness, waiting for foolish wanderers to step into their domain. She remembered sitting by the fire as a child, listening to the village storyteller. His voice had been deep and foreboding as he spoke of the nyoka, the serpent spirit that could take the form of a crying infant to lure kind-hearted souls into the wilderness. Those who followed the sound never returned. Some said the jungle swallowed them whole. Others believed they became spirits themselves, forever doomed to wander the trees. There were also stories of shapeshifters, spirits that could take on the forms of people you loved, whispering your name in the wind, calling you toward them. And then there was the path that never ends, a cursed trail that would twist and turn, leading travelers deeper and deeper into the jungle until they forgot who they were. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, breaking her thoughts. She shivered. The crying baby sounded closer now, weak and fragile, as if it wouldn't survive much longer. What if this time it wasn't a spirit? What if a real child was out there, abandoned and helpless? Nia turned to glance back at the village. The distant glow of the lanterns was still visible, a reminder that she could turn back. She could wake the elders, tell them what she had heard, and let them decide. But she knew they would only shake their heads, muttering about spirits and curses, refusing to follow the sound. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every muscle in her body told her to retreat, to run back to the safety of her home. And yet, she found herself stepping forward instead. The ground beneath her feet was damp, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and unfamiliar flowers. The jungle loomed around her, vast and endless, its shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The baby's cries grew even more desperate, filled with fear and urgency. And so, despite the warnings, despite the stories, despite the terror pressing down on her shoulders, Nia walked deeper into the unknown. The deeper Nia walked into the jungle, the more unnatural everything became. The familiar sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects had disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that felt alive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees stood tall and still, their branches twisting into claw-like shapes against the moonlight. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, almost like blood. She tightened her grip on the lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows that moved strangely, as if shifting on their own. The baby's cries continued, but something was wrong. One moment they sounded distant, far ahead in the darkness. The next, they were so close it felt as though the unseen child was right behind her. Nia stopped, her breath shallow. The ground beneath her feet felt strange. Looking down, she saw markings in the dirt. Faint impressions, almost like footprints, but twisted and incomplete. They looked human at first glance, but the closer she examined them, the more they seemed to shift and change, as if they refused to be recognized for what they truly were. A chill ran down her spine. These were not normal footprints. They were something else. She scanned the trees, suddenly aware of how dense the jungle had become around her. The path she had taken moments ago now seemed unfamiliar, the trees appearing closer together, as if the forest had shifted behind her. The baby's cries echoed again, bouncing off the trees in an unnatural way. And then, a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves, but Nia knew she had heard it. Someone, or something, had whispered her name. Her chest tightened. She turned quickly, holding up the lantern, but the jungle remained still. Yet she could feel it. Eyes, watching her, hidden in the darkness. She swallowed hard, her mind screaming at her to turn back. But just as she took a step backward, the baby's cry pierced the silence once more. Louder, more desperate than before. It was suffering. It needed help. Ignoring the pounding of her heart, Nia forced herself to move forward, deeper into the jungle, into the shadows that seemed to close in around her. Nia pushed forward, her footsteps slow and cautious as she followed the sound of the crying baby. The jungle had swallowed the last remnants of moonlight, leaving her lantern as the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. The path twisted and turned unnaturally, as though the jungle itself was guiding her deeper into its heart. Then, through the dense trees, she saw it. A village, hidden deep within the jungle. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, it was real. Small mud huts stood in neat rows, their roofs covered in thick layers of vines and moss. The place looked ancient, like it had been untouched for centuries. Yet to her horror, several fire pits still glowed with dying embers, sending thin wisps of smoke curling into the night air. Someone had been here recently, or worse, they were still here. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. The baby's cries had stopped. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, pressing in around her like an unseen force. Her pulse quickened as she stepped cautiously into the abandoned village. The place was eerily intact, as if the people had just stepped away moments ago but never returned. Clay pots sat undisturbed, tools rested against the walls, and bundles of dried herbs hung from doorways. And then she saw it. A wooden cradle stood in the center of the village, slightly swaying, though there was no wind. Nia's breath caught in her throat. The cradle was old, its wood dark and cracked with age, yet it rocked gently, as if an unseen hand was lulling a baby to sleep. She took a shaky step forward. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy she didn't understand. She knew she shouldn't get closer, knew that something was deeply wrong with this place, but her body moved on its own. Peering inside the cradle, her breath hitched. It was empty. yet she had heard the cries just moments ago. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the village, rattling the huts and sending leaves skittering across the ground. The cradle stopped rocking. The fires flickered wildly, and for a brief moment, she swore she heard whispers, soft, hushed voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Then, a shadow moved. It was quick, darting between the huts. Nia's entire body tensed. She wasn't alone. Fear wrapped around her chest like a vice. She needed to leave. Now her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run. But as she took a step toward the path she had come from, a voice, low and raspy, called her name from the darkness. And Nia knew, without a doubt, that she had stepped into a place where no living person should be. Nia's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the eerie silence pressed in around her. The whisper of her name still lingered in the air, sending a chill down her spine. She turned in slow, hesitant movements, scanning the village for the source of the voice. Then, from the shadows between two huts, a figure emerged, an old woman. Her skin was dark and weathered, marked with deep lines that seemed to tell stories of centuries past. She wore a tattered cloth draped over her frail shoulders, her bones visible beneath thin, wrinkled skin. But her eyes were sharp, glowing faintly in the dim light, as if they held the wisdom of something beyond the living world. Nia took an instinctive step back, gripping her lantern tightly. The old woman didn't move, didn't blink. She only watched. "You should not have come here, child," the woman finally spoke, her voice raspy like dry leaves scraping against stone. Nia swallowed hard. Her mouth was dry, her limbs frozen. I heard a baby crying," she managed to say. "It sounded like it needed help." The old woman's expression darkened. She slowly shook her head, the weight of something ancient and terrible settling into her features. "That is no baby," she whispered. "It is a spirit, a lost soul calling for a mother." Nia's stomach twisted. "A spirit?" she echoed, the words heavy on her tongue. The woman nodded. She stepped forward, the firelight from the dying embers flickering over her face. "Long ago," she began, her voice carrying the weight of an old legend. "This village was home to a woman who gave birth to a child she did not want. The child was weak, sickly. The mother, full of shame and fear, abandoned it in the jungle, leaving it to die." Nia felt a sickening unease crawl over her skin. "The villagers did not find the baby until it was too late," the old woman continued. "But something changed that night. The jungle itself kept the child's soul. It did not rest. It did not fade." Nia's grip tightened on the lantern. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," the old woman said, "it calls to women desperate to find a mother. It cries, waiting for someone kind enough to follow." A shiver shot down Nia's spine. What happens to those who follow the cries? The old woman's eyes darkened. They never return. The words struck Nia like ice, settling deep in her bones. She turned to look at the rocking cradle, now still, silent, ominous. A wave of nausea rolled through her. She had nearly picked it up, nearly held it. A sudden gust of wind rattled the trees, the jungle groaning in response. The old woman stepped back, her gaze shifting toward the darkness beyond the village. "It knows you are here, child. And now, it wants you." Nia's heart slammed against her ribs. The jungle felt tighter, the shadows longer. She had to leave. But something deep inside her whispered that it was already too late. Nia took a shaky step backward, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. "It wants you." Her fingers trembled around the lantern's handle. The air around her felt thicker, pressing against her like an invisible weight. She turned toward the jungle, her instincts screaming for escape. Then, the baby's cry returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the cradle. It was inside her head. A sharp, piercing wail rang through her skull, rattling her thoughts, drowning out every other sound. It wasn't just a noise, it was a feeling, raw and consuming, filling her with unbearable grief and loneliness. The cradle, silent just moments ago, began to shake violently. Nia snapped her gaze back to it. The wooden frame creaked and groaned, the old wood splintering as if something inside was trying to force its way out. Her breath caught in her throat as a thick, black mist began to seep from the cradle, twisting and curling like living tendrils reaching for the air. And then it rose. A figure, small and grotesque, lifted itself from the cradle, its movements unnatural, jerky, wrong. It looked like a baby, but it wasn't. Its skin was grey and stretched too tightly over its tiny frame, its limbs thin and angular like brittle twigs. Its head lolled to one side, as if its neck had been broken, yet its body moved with deliberate purpose. And then it opened its eyes. Hollow, black, endless, a terrible gaping void that pulled at Nia's soul. It opened its mouth, far too wide, and let out a sound that was not a cry, but a scream, a guttural, wrenching wail filled with pain, rage, and something far worse. Nia stumbled backward, her legs barely holding her up, her vision blurred with panic, her mind struggling to comprehend the horror crawling toward her. She turned, desperate to find the old woman, but she was gone. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no shadow, as if she had never been there at all. The spirit lurched forward, its twisted fingers reaching for her, the black mist coiled around her feet. And Nia knew, if she didn't run now, she never would. Nia turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her feet pounded against the damp earth. The jungle seemed to close in around her, the towering trees shifting, bending, twisting unnaturally, as if they were alive, as if they wanted to keep her inside. The baby's cry followed her, no longer coming from behind, but all around her. "Nia!" She froze mid-step, her heart lurching violently against her ribs. The voice was different now, not just a cry, but a whisper, a sickly sweet call, filled with longing and something much darker. "Nia, don't run." She swallowed back a scream and pushed forward, but the ground betrayed her. Thick roots burst from the soil, twisting like writhing fingers, latching onto her ankles. She tumbled forward, catching herself on her hands, the lantern slipping from her grip and rolling away. The flame inside flickered wildly, casting eerie, distorted shadows against the jungle floor. She kicked frantically, trying to free herself, but the roots only tightened, pulling her down as if the earth itself was trying to swallow her. A sharp rustling made her snap her head up, and there it was, standing just a few feet ahead, the spirit baby. Its frail, broken body jerked unnaturally as it moved, its hollow black eyes locked onto her. The mist around it curled like hungry tendrils, stretching toward her. Nia thrashed harder, yanking at the roots, clawing at the dirt. She couldn't move fast enough. The spirit tilted its head, its too wide mouth splitting open, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "Nia!" it called again, dragging its twisted body forward. "Be my mother!" Terror threatened to choke her. She had to escape. But how? Then, deep in the recesses of her panicked mind, a memory surfaced. Her grandmother's voice. "When the spirits call to you, child, when the shadows reach for you, do not answer with fear, answer with faith." Nia's lips trembled. She barely remembered the words, but she had to try. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to ignore the darkness creeping closer. And then she began to whisper the ancient prayer her grandmother had once taught her. Her voice wavered at first, barely above a breath, but as she spoke, the air around her shifted. The roots loosened. The mist recoiled. The spirit baby let out a piercing screech, its voice twisting into something no longer human. But Nia did not stop. She kept chanting, louder now, her voice filled with desperation and defiance. The jungle shuddered, the trees groaning as if in pain. and for the first time since she had stepped into this nightmare, the spirit took a step back. Nia's voice trembled as she kept chanting, her grandmother's ancient prayer spilling from her lips like a lifeline. The jungle shuddered around her, the very air thick with unseen forces battling for control. The spirit baby let out a blood-curdling shriek, a sound so unnatural that it sent violent chills down Nia's spine. The black mist around it began to unravel, curling away like smoke in the wind. Its hollow eyes widened in terror, as if it finally understood. It was losing its grip on her. Then, a golden sliver of light pierced through the trees, the first light of dawn. As the sun's rays crept across the jungle floor, everything began to change. The shadows that had moved on their own recoiled, pulling back into the depths of the forest. The roots that had snared her ankles withered into nothing, releasing her. The thick, oppressive air grew lighter, and the night's suffocating presence began to lift. The spirit baby let out a final, mournful wail, its tiny, twisted body flickering like a dying flame. It reached out, its voice soft now, almost sorrowful. "Mama." Then it vanished. The jungle exhaled. The unnatural silence faded, replaced by the distant sound of birds greeting the dawn. The nightmare was over. Nia's body shook as she pulled herself to her feet, her limbs weak, her lungs burning. Her clothes were torn, her skin scraped and bruised, but she was alive. With every ounce of strength she had left, she staggered forward, back toward the village. The path that had once twisted and turned against her was now clear, as if the jungle itself had released its hold. She stumbled through the underbrush, her legs heavy, her mind numb. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, the familiar sight of her village came into view. Relief crashed over her like a tidal wave. She barely made it past the gates before her legs gave out. A few villagers spotted her and rushed forward, their faces filled with alarm. "Nia!" someone called. "Where have you been?" What happened? She tried to answer, but her throat was dry, her mind still tangled in the horrors of the night. She shook her head, her breath uneven, her fingers gripping the dirt beneath her. Finally, she managed to whisper the only truth she knew. It wasn't a baby. And as the sun rose over the village, she prayed she would never hear that cry again. The village was silent as Nia sat before the council of elders, their weathered faces shadowed by the flickering firelight. The village square, usually alive with voices and laughter, felt heavy with something unspoken. The night's terror clung to her skin, and though she had returned home, she knew she was not safe. Elder Babu, the oldest among them, leaned forward, his milky eyes searching hers. "You heard the cry, and you followed," he said, his voice a whisper of regret. "You should not have gone, child." Nia swallowed hard. "I thought it was a real baby," she admitted. "I couldn't ignore it." A murmur passed through the elders. Some shook their heads, others closed their eyes as if in silent prayer. Elder Mariama, the village's spiritual guide, spoke next. "That cry has haunted this land for generations," she said. "You are not the first to hear it, but those who do..." She hesitated. "They do not always return." Nia shuddered. "I barely did," she whispered. "But I spoke the prayer, the spirit. It vanished." Elder Babu let out a heavy sigh, his fingers gripping his wooden staff. "It did not vanish," he corrected. "It let you go, for now." A deep chill settled in Nia's bones. "What do you mean?" Mariama met her gaze, her expression grim. "Once you hear the cry, you are marked," she said. "The spirit knows your name now. It knows your scent. It will call for you again." Nia's heartbeat pounded in her ears. "No, I escaped. The sun rose and it disappeared. It's over." The elders exchanged solemn glances. "It is never over so easily," Mariama murmured. "The spirit is patient. It does not need to chase you tonight or tomorrow. It will wait, just beyond the veil, whispering, watching, until the time is right. Nia felt the blood drain from her face. When is the time right? Elder Babu's eyes darkened. The next full moon. A hush fell over the gathering. The next full moon was less than a week away. The spirit will come for you again, Mariama said. And this time, it will not let you go. Panic swelled in Nia's chest. Then what do I do? How do I stop it? There is only one way, Babu said. A ritual, an ancient one. It has been done before, but it is dangerous. Mariama nodded. You must sever the spirit's bond to this world. Banish it back to the place between life and death. If you do not, you will never know peace again. Nia's hands curled into fists. She had faced the spirit once and barely survived. How could she face it again? Still, there was no choice. She had to fight. She had to survive. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Tell me what I have to do." The ritual was unlike anything Nia had ever experienced. The elders gathered in the sacred grove, a place hidden deep within the jungle where the earth pulsed with ancient power. The trees stood impossibly tall, their thick roots twisting over the ground like the fingers of unseen spirits. A great fire roared at the center, its embers dancing in the night air, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the villagers who had come to witness. Nia stood barefoot on the cool earth, her pulse drumming in her ears. Elder Mariama traced white chalk across her forehead, murmuring words in a tongue so old that even the elders barely understood it. The scent of burning herbs filled the air, thick and bitter. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from beyond the fire's glow, spirits, ancestors, or something else entirely. You must not break the circle, Mariama warned, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, if you do, the spirit will claim you. Nia nodded, swallowing the fear lodged in her throat. The ritual began. Drums thundered through the clearing, a heartbeat in the darkness. The elders moved in slow, deliberate steps, chanting prayers passed down for centuries. Nia stood at the center of the circle, her hands clenched at her sides. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen, but undeniable. Then, a sound, a familiar sound, rose above the chanting. The cry of the baby. Nia stiffened. It was distant at first, no louder than a whisper. But with every beat of the drums, it grew, winding through the trees, weaving through the chanting voices until it filled the clearing. The fire shuddered, its flames twisting unnaturally. The shadows around them deepened, stretching, moving. Nia's breath came fast and shallow. The elders did not falter. They raised their voices, their chants growing louder, stronger. The spirit did not like that. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, scattering embers into the night. The trees groaned, their branches bending inward, as if trying to close around them. The baby's cry became a wail, raw and full of rage. Then, Nia felt it, a cold touch at her ankle. She bit down a scream, refusing to look down. She would not break the circle. The wind howled, the fire dimmed, and for a terrible moment, it felt as if the jungle itself would swallow them whole. Then, a final, deafening roar. The flames exploded outward, then instantly collapsed into embers. The shadows vanished. The air grew still. Silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Elder Babu let out a long breath. "It is done," he said. A murmur of relief rippled through the villagers. The tension in Nia's chest loosened, just enough for her to take a breath that didn't feel like drowning. She was safe, or so she thought. That night, exhaustion pulled her into sleep the moment she lay down. The events of the night replayed in her mind, tangled with memories and fears. But for the first time in days, she felt warmth, safety, until a sound, faint, distant, a baby's cry. Naya's body stiffened. Her breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just her imagination. She told herself the ritual had worked. But the cry grew louder, closer. Her fingers curled into the thin fabric of her blanket. The air in her hut felt different. Cold. Heavy. Her heart pounded as she slowly opened her eyes. And in the darkness, just beyond her door, the crying continued.